this story is all wrapped up with really our first parliaments, true parliaments. So should we just kick off with exactly what happened? Okay, Winston Churchill tells us that, quote, "The later years of Henry III's troubled reign were momentous in their consequences for the growth of English institutions. This may perhaps be called the seed time of our parliamentary system. Though few participants in the sowing could have foreseen the results that were eventually to be achieved." Because that's often the way, isn't it? Especially if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, is that they could never have known what they were setting in train.
No.
I think quite often some people have a problem with the original founding fathers of the project of the European Union. They didn't know in the 50s, after World War II, that it would end up with some sort of crazy open border thing going on.
Yeah.
And
a dystopian total managerial state.
Right.
Wasn't actually what they were asking for.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So with Parliament, our story of Parliament, the things that first sort of set it in train were very far removed from what we have today. They couldn't have dreamed. We said it, didn't we, all about Magna Carta?
Yeah.
The barons at Runnymede in 1215 couldn't have dreamed that what they were doing would lead to sort of freedom for most people, at least in the Western world.
Yeah, because I mean, what they were really trying to do is just maintain things as they had always been. You know, it's a conservative document, basically, as most of English constitutional history actually is when you think about it. But they weren't trying to revolutionise something. They were just trying to preserve something they perceived to already exist. So
during Henry III's life, after particularly, and we talked about his sort of doomed deal with the Pope over Sicily, that was kind of one of the last straws. They became aware, if they weren't already aware, but became aware to the point where they were prepared to act on it, that he's just not good enough as an autocratic monarch. He's not up to the task. He's making sort of childish decisions, weird decisions. So sort of a programme for reform was set in place. A commission was set up to sort of look at government. Let's look at the nature of government. Another thing to say before we go on is that, you know, we're still nowhere near the modern concept of a nation state. We're nowhere near that. You know, there's no police. There's no sense of sort of a national, any real national institutions. There's the crown and his household, and you know, very little else.
Yeah, the territory of England. England as a national entity does exist.
Of course.
And the English recognise themselves as a unique and discrete
kingdom, though, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very specifically a kingdom.
A discrete ethnic group. But in that, the actual ownership of the areas of England are on a personal basis that has a hierarchy of oaths and obligations that lead up to the crown and the king themselves. So it's all personal rule and dominion rather than some sort of abstract concept of the nation itself and the nation state, as you're saying.
So it's only Henry III's grandfather, Henry II, that really began to sort of make a type of judiciary with a bureaucracy, you know, the King's Bench, the King's Courts and things.
Yeah.
So, you know,
justice would have been a lot more localised prior to this. This is what a lot of people don't understand. It's like the laws. I mean, for example, when Alfred the Great issues a law code, he basically just looks at what all the other kings are doing in their little realms, the small kingdoms of England. And it would have been very much similar in sort of Henry's day.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And so it's only really in this period that we start to have the very first types of parliament. So Churchill goes on, the Commission for Reform set about its work seriously, and in 1258 its proposals were embodied in the Provisions of Oxford. Now these are very, very important. They're sort of up there with Magna Carta in terms of these sort of foundational documents, foundational principles, which if you didn't have them, we wouldn't end up where we are today. So these Provisions of Oxford are very important. Supplemented and extended in 1259, the next year, by the Provisions of Westminster. And where we talked about in Magna Carta, there's no mention of Parliament.
No.
Well, in the provisions of Oxford and Westminster there are, but still, again, to stress, not the Parliament as we know it, the House of Commons and the House of Lords and all that sort of thing, a speaker and nothing like that really.
It's not democratically elected and it's not representative.
No, right, yeah. No, absolutely not representative. The baronial movement represented something deeper than dislike of alien councillors. The two sets of provisions taken together represent a considerable shift of interests from the standpoint of Magna Carta. The Great Charter was mainly concerned to define various points of law, whereas the provisions of Oxford deal with the overriding question of by whose advice and through what officials royal government should be carried on. Many of the clauses of the provisions of Westminster, moreover, mark a limitation of baronial rather than of royal jurisdiction. The fruits of Henry II's work were now to be seen. The nation was growing stronger, more self-conscious and self-confident. The notable increase in judicial activity throughout the country, the more frequent visits of the judges and officials, all of them dependent upon local cooperation, educated the country knights in political responsibility and administration. This process, which shaped the future of British institutions, had its first effects in the 13th century. So actually, let me read another quick paragraph straight away, because it just sort of leads on to it and gives us a bit more detail. The staple of the barons' demands was that the king in future should govern by a council of 15. So we're starting to get specific now.
Yeah.
It's not just, I would like this concept, this idea that we could be, no, we're going to put this in place with this number of people and do it like this and so on. So it is fair, I think, to say that the reign of Henry III, the provisions of Oxford and Westminster and the so-called parliaments that come out of it, I think it is right to say that's the beginning of Parliament. So a council of 15 to be elected by 4 persons, 2 from the baronial and 2 from the royal party. It is significant that the King's proclamation accepting the arrangement in English as well as in French is the first public document to be issued in both languages since the time of William the Conqueror. So a quick word to say there is that by the time of Henry V, so still another 150 odd years later, that's when things are sort of only in English. We sort of drop a lot of the French. But again, you can see in the reign of Henry III, again, very pivotal. Not as famous as John or Longshanks, but still such a very, very pivotal period. So things as being, official things as being written in English, at least as well as French. For a spell, this council, animated and controlled by Simon De Montfort, governed the land. They had each other in proper check, sharing among themselves the greater executive offices and entrusting the actual administration to quote-unquote lesser men, as was then widely thought to be desirable, because they realised that the magnates, this is, the baronial class, they realised that we can't let one of us become too overly powerful.
Yeah.
There's no point replacing the king with an all-powerful baron. So they were sort of self-aware enough and not too vain or ambitious enough to say, you know, some of these really, really key posts, let's let so-called lesser men hold those posts, because the idea that if you're not extremely rich and landed and your lineage is extremely important, you could never actually try and become a monarch or anything like that.
Yeah,
you know,
there's no chance of a commoner like Thomas Becket trying to become the king, basically.
And they did that in sort of in ancient medieval Chinese history, all over the world, in the Byzantine period. You know, someone that could never truly rival the emperor or the king, like a eunuch, say.
Well, I was literally about to say that explains the preponderance of eunuchs in imperial bureaucracies.
We can let them be an extremely powerful counsellor
Because they can't pass it on to any children.
Right, yeah. And so the barons of the 13th century realised exactly the same thing and sort of wrote that in, hard-baked that into this burgeoning constitution deliberately. It's fairly forward-thinking. I think it's pretty good. The magnates, once their own class interests were guarded and their rights, which up to a certain point were the rights of the nation, were secure, did not wish to put the levers of power in the hands of one or two of their number. The idea, however, of a cabinet of politicians chosen from the patrician class, with highly trained functionaries of no political status operating under them, had in it a long vitality and many resurrections.
Yeah, you can see the germination of the civil service here, can't you?
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. So we do want to sort of sit above things and really control the truly key things, like this council of 15, and who gets to pick that council of 15. We'll retain that, sort of the ultimate power in a way.
Yeah.
But everything else we'll allow and should be in the hands of others. The vast majority of the bureaucracy, we can sort of share that power, if you like.
You are right, it is quite forward thinking, actually.
So we can start to talk about De Montfort himself, because he becomes sort of a key player, because although I said about they didn't want one of their number to become overly powerful, unless you have lots and lots of really strict things in place, checks and balances in place to prevent it, someone's going to probably attempt to take it for themselves, or rather events sort of force it that way.
Yeah, the competent man rises, the incompetent fail, and so he's left holding it all.
Or if there's some sort of war or civil unrest or anything like that, any sort of existential threat, you kind of need one man in control sometimes. That's it, for example, I just sprung to mind, but the American founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and their constitution, well, immediately they had to put General Washington in charge as a type of military dictator on some level, because they just had to.
And it's interesting, just as a quick side, the American Constitution doesn't make a provision like the Romans had for a dictator. It's you know, especially as, like you say, they had to do it almost immediately. You'd think they'd be like, okay, maybe in times of stress, you know, extreme calamity, maybe that isn't it, but it's just not there, which I think is interesting.
Because the Americans had to fight and win by force their independence. So luckily, George Washington was not an ambitious person in that sense.
Well, that was always the question regarding him, wasn't it?
He was very, very humble. You know, sometimes after they'd won their independence, they come to him and say, perhaps you should be king. He was like Oliver Cromwell. Laughed that off, of course not. Don't be silly. No one forced him to only serve as president for 2 terms. He decided that would be the right thing to do. He saw it as his duty not to dominate the nation. They're lucky. If he could have been a Sulla type, he could have been a Stalin type. The Americans got lucky with George Washington. He was a very humorless man, but nonetheless, he was sort of the right man for the job. He wasn't consumed by his own vanity, shall we say. Okay, so Simon De Montfort comes onto the scene. We mentioned him a bit last time, didn't we? He had been put in charge of various portions of land in Gascony, which we still controlled in southern France. And there'd been various uprisings there, which he'd put down with a firm hand, we're told. But he'd become sort of so powerful and well liked that he had his enemies at court. They tried to take him down and failed. He'd been put on trial, but he'd been acquitted. But his relationship with Henry had fallen apart. Because Henry didn't, completely back him up, and it's a fairly long and tortuous relationship between them. So Charles Oman wrote this: "The sudden outburst of wrath on the part of the baronage in 1258 is explained not only by the fact that all men had lost patience with King Henry, for that had been the case for many years, but much more by the fact that the baronage had at last found a champion and mouthpiece in Simon de Montfort, the great Earl of Leicester. Simon was not one who might have been expected to prove a wise and patriotic statesman and a good Englishman, for he had originally come into notice as one of the king's foreign favourites." Again, Simon de Montfort is not English. His father was, the great
French crusader.
Yeah, he put down the Albigenses and things.
So I mean, just saying, be careful of those foreign favourites.
Oh, yeah, as always, story as old as time. His grandmother had been the heiress to the earldom of Leicester, but she had married a Frenchman, the Count of Montfort. Their child, Simon the Elder, a great crusading chief and a cruel prosecutor of heretics. He was a bitter enemy of King John, and had never been permitted to get hold of the Leicester estates. In 1232, his son, Simon the Younger, this is our Simon, Simon the Younger, came across to England to beg King Henry to make over to him the confiscated lands of his grandmother's earldom. Henry could never resist a petitioner, especially when he was a foreigner. He not only took Simon into favour and granted him the earldom of Leicester, but he married him to his sister, the Princess Eleanor, and for a time made him his confidant. But the king's sudden friendship did not endure, and ere long he tired of Simon and sent him over to govern Guienne, which was always in a state of chronic insurrection. Simon put down rebellion with a strong hand and made himself unpopular with the Gascons, who sent many complaints to the king. But the fatal cause of estrangement between him and the Earl was a money matter. Simon had expended large sums in the king's service, using his own money and borrowing more. When he sent his accounts to Henry, the latter could not or would not pay, and very meanly allowed the loss to fall on Simon. Henry III is not a good politician. It's always an anachronism to call people from the medieval period or the ancient period politicians, but you get the point. You get what I'm saying, right?
I think we'd established that last time as well.
Yeah, he doesn't make good calls.
Yeah.
Now, in all sorts of people's career in history, you make the odd bad call. Sometimes one bad one is all it needs to bring you down and destroy you and your realm or whatever. But if you kind of always make the bad call, right? You always do the silly thing.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.